you're still alive, my old friend. Still, old friend. You've managed to kill just about everyone else, but like a poor marksman, you keep missing the target.
You know, it's kind of funny seeing the same stories we've always enjoyed resurface in settings that are really weird and out there. Like humanity's joined with other alien races and discovered faster than light travel, and replicators and all this good stuff, and yet the drama that unfolds isn't that much unlike the drama that we face every day in the present day. A part of me wonders if, hundreds of years from now, people will look upon wondrous things like space travel with that same level of mundanity. Would human drama eventually supersede the amazement at something like interstellar travel? This game, or rather this series of games, is rooted in those science fiction traditions of speculation. It dreams of worlds beyond our own, and imagines a world where even as humanity drifts further and further from Earth, even as unpalatable alien terrors surround us, the problems that we deal with are still very human. It's a warm feeling, wondering if the rest of the universe feels anything like we do. And like the best science fiction, the Mass Effect trilogy is rooted in these simultaneous feelings of wonder and familiarity. Science fiction and space opera. Those are the two genres that immediately leap to mind when I think of this specific trilogy of games. And yeah, I said trilogy, I'm not counting Andromeda, I'm sorry. Science fiction is just that. It is scientific fiction. It speculates on what could theoretically happen given science and technology's current course. There is a fundamental difference between the two genres of science fiction and fantasy, even though bookstores still continue to group the two together. Fantasy regards the imaginary, and often asks its audience to ignore any lapses in logic for the sake of telling an interesting story. In science fiction, that doesn't fly. Science fiction relates to the plausible and the yet-to-be unproven. Or, to put it another way that I'm sure you've all heard 1,000 times, Star Trek and Star Wars. Star Trek, at the time, concerned itself with what humanity's space adventures could possibly look like in a few centuries. Every piece of technology was not only explained in a plausible manner, again, at the time, but also treated as mundane. Every fantastical element is explained in a way that makes it seem credible in the future. By contrast, Star Wars is fantasy. The Force surrounds us, connects us, and binds the galaxy together. People can shoot lightning out of their fingertips and brainwash people just by concentrating really hard. None of this is explained, and none of it needs to be explained. Ahem. Star Wars handwaves its plot holes and logical gaps by saying, it was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and midi-chlorians probably did it. Now, I'm not saying that either of these two genres are necessarily better than the other. They're both very effective at telling very engaging human stories, often with social issues that would be unpalatable in any other genre. But the cool thing about science fiction is we can look at it and we can think, man, that could happen to us one day. But the genre that unites Star Trek and Star Wars, and ultimately Mass Effect, is the space opera. Space opera is a catch-all term for large-scale, often melodramatic stories that take place in outer space. It was originally a derogatory term. It was used by science fiction author Wilson Tucker to relate hacky, grinding, stinking, outworn spaceship yarns to soap operas, which, well, share all those qualities. But the term eventually evolved to define interstellar adventures that feature traditional romantic adventures in outer space. They're the good old stories, dashing heroes, daring action, epic warfare, and drama that humans have related to since, hell, Gilgamesh. Except it's all in space! Brian W. Aldiss, a popular sci-fi author from the 50s and 60s, gave a pretty solid 10-step definition of the space opera. The world must be in peril. There must be a quest, and a man or woman to meet the mighty hour. That man or woman must confront aliens and exotic creatures. Space must flow past the ports like wine from a pitcher. Blood must rain down the palace steps, and ships launch out of the lowering dark. There must be a woman or man fairer than the skies, and a villain darker than a black hole. And all must come right in the end. So how does Mass Effect relate to all this? Well, you probably got the picture from watching the footage along with that 10-step sequence, but I find it fascinating because it's not only a traditional space opera with a traditional story, but also some of the hardest science fiction that's graced the video gaming medium outside of maybe System Shock or Fallout. The only real truly fantastical element of the Mass Effect games is right there in the title, the concept of Mass Effect itself. As in, a certain type of space rock can be used to alter the mass of objects around it, and it's used for everything from FTL travel, force fields, KOTOR Jedi abilities, and a lot of stuff. But even then, this space rock is not treated as a mystical or spiritual entity like the Force or the One Ring. Element Zero and the Mass Effect that it induces are parts of everyday society in the world of Mass Effect. It's as important to us as planes or cars are to us here in the real world, and it's treated with that same sense of mundanity. Both Shepard and Luke Skywalker can move objects around telekinetically, but where a Force user is something really special in the Star Wars universe, it is not so in Mass Effect. In theory, we could end up finding this Element Zero stuff on a far-off planet and utilize its effects for ourselves. It's a very unlikely possibility given the laws of physics, but as science fiction concepts go, it's pretty believable. And in a fictional universe where it does happen, it's so overused that it's become an uninteresting part of everyday life, like a replicator from Star Trek or the abundance of atomic energy in the pre-war history of Fallout. And that's the way that Mass Effect kinda sneaks away with both being a space opera and a good work of hard science fiction. It renders what's fantastic to us, the players, mundane to the characters in-universe that aren't human. You could read this trilogy in a bunch of different ways, and a lot of people have. I choose to look at it the same way I think most people do. It's a story of humanity coming to terms with the fact that it is no longer the most dominant force in the known universe. That is an idea that has been unpalatable to Western civilization since... maybe ever. Western empires and civilizations have been historically conquerors and colonialists, claiming land, appropriating culture, instilling their own values wherever they go, and generally being the dominant force of change in human history, for better or worse.
There are many religions in the world, and they're all equal, but the Christians are the main one. That's what I tell them. The Christians won. If you don't believe me, let me ask you a question. What year is it? Jesus, plus 2017 years, 4 months, and 3 days is when your license expires.
I am definitely really oversimplifying it here, but the point is, there is no aspect of human life on this entire planet that hasn't been shaped in some part by Western colonialism and expansion. It's a troubling fact that we don't often like to acknowledge, and many other civilizations have been unjustly trampled on and exploited to prove it. But that fact is the backbone of the Mass Effect trilogy's themes and ideas, both as a space opera and as hard science fiction. Because in Mass Effect's backstory, human civilization, again, Western-influenced human civilization, goes into space and discovers another civilization that severely outmatches them. We, humanity, humbled by the superior technology and military power of other alien races, try to integrate ourselves into a larger, bureaucratic, sometimes unpalatable society. That is the jumping off point for a lot of Mass Effect's drama, conflicts, and decisions. Hell, the Paragon and Renegade systems make a whole lot more sense when you look at them from this angle instead of the generic good and evil morality systems that you see in other games. While people talk about Paragon and Renegade using the good cop, bad cop analogy, and that does make sense, I'd like to argue that it reflects two different answers to the problem of Western civilization suddenly no longer being the most dominant force in the world. Paragons reflect the attitude of humility, of accepting that fact and hoping to work together with other intergalactic races and civilizations for the better of everybody. Renegades reject that idea altogether, instead taking opportunities to show their might and take control like Western civilizations always have, with intimidation and hostility. So while a Paragon looks at the genophage cure in Mass Effect 3 and sees an opportunity to diplomatically bring two hostile civilizations together, a Renegade would exploit that opportunity, eliminate the Krogans, and show the Solarians that humanity means business. While I'm on the subject, I should clarify that I am a coward, and I've never gone full Renegade in any of my playthroughs. Shocking, I know. A guy can suffer through a genocide run in Undertale, but can't bring himself to go full Renegade. Yada yada yada. My first playthrough was pure Paragon, and my second and third playthroughs, which is what you're seeing on the screen, were kind of a soft Renegade. As in, I acted all tough, I intimidated other people, and I showed the other characters who's in charge, but when asked to do some of the more monstrous things, I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't bring myself to kill the Rachni Queen, or effectively commit genocide against the Krogans. Before really thinking this kind of thing through, I saw that as a flaw with the game design. I saw Paragon and Renegade not as two answers to a question, but as a role-playing tool like the light and dark side meter in KOTOR or the karma systems in the Fallout games. But after really thinking about it and writing this episode, I've come to terms with the sheer moral difficulty of playing a pure Renegade run. I find it a lot easier to make Paragon decisions and answer the humanity entering a new stage of civilization problem with kindness and humility. Many other players find it easier to slip into the Renegade personality, to answer that problem with force and badassery. Hell, I'll admit that some of the series' most memorable and entertaining moments happen on the Renegade side.
This guy couldn't tie his bootlaces, much less fight.
I will tear her apart. My biotics are unstoppable.
Charge.
And if anything, the Mass Effect trilogy forces us to acknowledge that both of these sides have their consequences. Paragons have to deal with the fact that the Rachni Queen ends up getting indoctrinated and murdering a lot of innocent people by the time the third game rolls around. Renegades have to answer to entire races probably going extinct because of their actions on Noveria and Tuchanka. But it doesn't go in what I think is the wrong-headed direction that games like Bioshock Infinite go into, which implies that both sides of the game's conflict are wrong and evil, and that power absolutely corrupts. Mass Effect instead acknowledges that both Paragon and Renegade decisions can be justified. Those used to Western civilizations being in charge shouldn't be dismissed when they're scared of their ways of life going away in favor of a more united and universal society. And those who want to accept alien life as equals and work together in harmony aren't wrong to think that way either. So is there a single concrete answer to this issue? I don't know, man. I just make videos on YouTube about video games. But Mass Effect as a trilogy uses those science fiction tropes and plausible scientific possibilities hand in hand to explore this question in depth, and I think that's an incredible thing for a video game to do. Mass Effect doesn't really have a central message. It's a story of a remarkable human being who goes on an adventure to save the galaxy from eldritch Lovecraftian robots. No matter how you choose to lead humanity, Shepard will follow those 10 space opera steps. The world is in peril because the Reapers are gonna kill everything. There is a quest, or 3, to stop them. Shepard rises to meet the mighty hour. He or she confronts aliens and creatures that are exotic to humanity. Thanks to the Mass Effect, space flows past the ports like wine from a pitcher. Blood rains down the Citadel's steps. Ships launch out of the lowering dark. Often, there's a love interest fairer than the skies, and villains who literally come out of dark space. And depending on your point of view, all comes right in the end. But how Shepard interprets these events, how the player chooses to answer the all-important question of how does humanity deal with not being the strongest player anymore, that's all up to the player. Even though the story seems like a simple sci-fi space opera on the surface, this theming bleeds into nearly every other aspect of the story. The Council doesn't take the Reaper threat seriously at first because they don't take Shepard, the first human Spectre, seriously, even if he or she saves their lives at the end of the first game. Cerberus brings in Shepard to deal with the Reaper threat away from the bureaucracy of the Council, but even his or her old allies from the first game find it difficult to trust Shepard because Cerberus is a human supremacist group looking out for the interests of humanity alone, which becomes more and more evident as the series goes on. And even in the third game, with the Reapers knocking on the front doors of every council race, humans and aliens still find ways to make jabs at each other. Hell, the final choice, as hackneyed and rushed as it was, still boils down to that question. Do we work with the Reapers to rebuild, or do we rip them all to shreds so that they'll never attack us again? Do we show dominance, or do we allow them to help us? When you look at the series from the angle of that one question, it really does tessellate deeper and deeper into nearly every aspect of the game. Even if they're not dealing with humanity's struggle, your squad mates also struggle with the conflict of compassion versus dominance. The most obvious example of this is Garrus, who fundamentally transforms as a character based on your actions, and he views Shepard as a role model. You can pull him out of his dark and cynical ways, even to the point of him rejoining the bureaucratic CSEC. Alternatively, you could enable his violent tendencies and make him more like yourself if you're playing Renegade. He can get pretty brutal.
You know what else is bad for business? A broken neck.
See also the conflict between Tali and Legion. Both of them are avatars from two sides of a pretty horrific conflict. Tali just wants justice for her people, and she's right to think that way. But Legion wants the Geth to break away from the Reapers and reunite with Tali's people, and he's also right to think that way. If you don't make the right choices early on, this can lead to a really painful choice in the third game, which I had to make in my first run through. It was really tough. And speaking of tough choices involving Legion, there's also his loyalty mission in the second game. Do you choose to essentially brainwash an entire people just because they want to kill you, or do you murder them all instead? Keep in mind that mass brainwashing is the Paragon solution. What is the truly compassionate option when either way their free will is demolished? It's a moral no-win situation, and yet both options have been frighteningly effective in expanding Western civilization and ideals in real-life history. And this is the kind of thing that makes Mass Effect truly special. It borrows from so many different tropes and so many works of literature and film, but its medium makes it its own thing. Because it is a work of interactive fiction, because players get to spend over 120 hours interacting and bonding with these characters and making their own decisions, the themes of it become so much more powerful. There's a reason that many people consider the characters to be the highlight of this trilogy, and it's because they reinforce the central theme without sacrificing their individuality. They all feel like an extension of Shepard, him or herself, but they do so in a way that allows their own vivid personalities to shine. And after spending so much time resolving their issues, earning their loyalty, and possibly even falling in love, they feel incredibly real. I understand that this is something the series is always praised for, but I feel that this is something BioWare truly deserves commendation for. Even after years of creating licensed works in pre-existing worlds, they still found a way to create their own universe and fill it with intriguing drama and unforgettable characters. The attention to detail that goes into that world building astounds me every time I boot these games up. Every planet has a detailed description and a story, even the ones that you never actually touch down on. Even if the explorable worlds in the first game feel very samey, they still have their own stories. Like, I didn't even know about the Prothean Spear on Ilitania until Noah Gervais brought it up in his excellent video on the trilogy. This is something that's tucked away on a seemingly random planet, and it's really easy to miss, but it offers incredible insight on the Protheans and how they relate to the races that currently reside in the galaxy, humanity included. And yeah, I understand why some people wouldn't want to read through every single codex entry or go to every single planet to read every single detail, but it's something that really appeals to me every time I play this series, and the Mass Effect trilogy is a masterclass at creating a world rich with detail. Even with the many flaws that this trilogy has, from repetitive exploration in the first game to uninteresting combat to basically the last 20 minutes of the third game, it's that commitment to its theming that makes this trilogy one of my favorite works of science fiction. It creates an interactive, detailed world that embraces the wonder of science fiction and the drama of space opera. It uses those tropes to ask a daring question of its audience, and it uses its characters and its plot as tools to further explore that question while letting the player answer it themselves. It devotes nearly its entirety, DLC included, to pondering that question while also allowing for the exploration of other themes like family, sacrifice, religion, atonement, bureaucracy. Fuck, this series covers a lot of stuff. but it still finds a way to keep the focus where it should be. And don't get me wrong, those flaws are very serious flaws. The second and third games never seem to find the right balance between too easy and impossibly hard. The first game has a really bad repetition problem, and even with the director's cut, the ending of the third game is riddled with plot holes and doesn't take the player's previous choices into enough consideration. And if you liked the multiplayer in the third game, that's fine, but you have to admit that tying your war assets to it in the vanilla version of the game was a pretty terrible design decision. But it says something about BioWare's team that even with all of those problems, people still fell head over heels in love with their world, their characters, and their storytelling. That even with a dud like Mass Effect Andromeda, people still hold hope about their upcoming projects. And that even with the Mass Effect trilogy's glaring issues, they've added a masterpiece to the canon of science fiction. And it'll stay there as long as science fiction continues to inspire people to move us all forward to the future. It doesn't really matter if BioWare continues to flip-flop with the series, or even if EA decides to let them make another one after Andromeda. This series has already left an indelible impact, and I hope people continue to experience it and learn more about themselves from it. Because that's what the best science fiction does. Hell, it's what the best literature does. It allows the reader to learn things about themselves, the world, and in the case of science fiction, the future.